what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the Haredi community, just setting some definitions. Then I'm going to sort of think about, when I think about the events of, let's say, the past year, we'll think about the day of October 7th itself, sort of what happened in the Haredi community, and then what I see are short-term and long-term developments. And then we'll end with thinking, so I say a favorite historian question, which are these things new, or are these things sort of manifestations of trends that have been going on for a long time? So I just want to start, and I would say the most important thing I'll probably say tonight is that Haredi Judaism, or Haredi Jews and Jewishness, is a really new thing. So what do I mean by that? It's not that keeping Jewish law stringently, right, is new, right? That's been happening for a long time. But this idea that, and that Haredi Judaism, ultra-Orthodoxy, we can talk about terminology, which can be complicated in the Q&A, is a modern response, right? It's a response in a world where the authority of tradition is not taken for granted, right? It's a new kind of identity that didn't exist, let's say, 300 years ago. And that's really important for us because we'll hear claims of unbroken chains of tradition, authenticity, but it's important to understand that this movement comes from a specific historical context and is actually quite new. When I talk about this with my students, we talk about, the things that happened during the Jewish Enlightenment and other things, and we talk about, different responses, Zionism, Reform Judaism, etc. And we talk about the response of the Haredi world as saying, not only are we not going to change what we do, right, into the challenges of modernity, we're going to build the walls higher to enable us to keep doing the same thing, even more so, right? A lot of you probably know this, there's no one central authority. I used to teach at the Naval Academy, so I used to use the metaphor of there's no pope, right? There's no one person. The term Orthodox becomes very confusing. A student asked me if they're all Orthodox, shouldn't they be viewing the same thing, not different things? Which, fair question, but the answer is no. And of course, there's dozens of different subgroups, right? There are three main groups, right? The way it's usually divided is Litvish or Yeshivish, right? Hasidic, and Mizrahi, right? We'll talk about all those a bit more. What's most interesting is that third category, Mizrahi Haredim, Jews who come from Arab and Islamic world, is really an Israeli development, right? If you think about the history of the Haredi Judaism, it really comes out of Europe, but there's been this interesting development in Israel for the past 2 or 3 decades of Mizrahi Jews who have taken on and changed Haredi identity. They are distinct from religious Zionists. We'll talk more about that. And in terms of politics, they tend to be non-Zionist. What that means in actuality is something we'll think about a lot today, with a vocal anti-Zionist minority. There's been increasing identification with Zionism, with supporting the Jewish state. Again, we'll think about what that means and how October 7th played a role in that. And in varying degrees, the state of Israel has supported the Haredi lifestyle, whether it's financially with things like child allowances, daycare bills, something that's been in the news recently, also through political parties. It's also really important to notice that, that this isn't just the Haredi community, that at least the majority of right-wing governments, if not all of them, have had Haredi parties in the coalition, have worked with the Haredi community to set this up, right? The state is really, really important here. Just a couple of statistics. These are all from the Israel Democracy Institute, which publishes the sort of Haredi State of the Nation each year. That I think is a good read. In 2023, about 13.6% of Israel's population was Haredi. That size, again, is predicted to be about 16% in 2030, and about 2 million people, up from 1.3 in 2033. However, even though the Haredi rates of fertility are pretty high, they've actually dropped a significant amount. In 2003, it was 7.5 births. In 2020, it's 6.5. So that's a really big drop in a really short amount of time. Of course, the number is still really high. But I think it's important for us to think, demography isn't destiny, and there are interesting changes afoot. Education. Ultra-Orthodox society, Haredi society is gendered, right? In one of the ways that manifests is that men and women have different educations. Women actually get significantly more secular education. We'll talk about what that means. Generally speaking, again, big generalization, there is not secular subjects for boys, which is taught very little, after the equivalent of middle school or not. There's a lot of change and discussion about this. One of the biggest things that happened was the Bells community, which is one of the biggest Hasidic groups in Israel, has agreed to some sort of secular studies. And they're seen as sort of a standard bearer, where the idea of Bells agree, more will follow. But again, those are the general things. This community is really poor. It's the poorest group in Israel. It's significantly higher than the general population, somewhere around 35% as opposed to 20%. And again, while there has been a decline, and also the rise of a Haredi middle class, which we'll talk about, it's still a relatively poor population. There has been a huge uptake in employment, participation in the workplace. More than 3/4 of ultra-Orthodox women work. It's around 80%. It is statistically not any different than other Jewish women in Israel. This is really interesting. And this is one of the facts that is most shocking to people who often don't know anything about the Haredi community, because they hear ultra-conservative group, women don't work. Well, actually, women work significantly more than the men, right? The rate in the ultra-Orthodox men in the workplace is now around 50%. It's plateaued in for the past couple of years. There are reasons for that, but of course there is this ideal, I should say, that that Haredi society should be a society of learners, right? The men should study Torah as much as possible. As I've alluded to really all along, there's been a lot of change, right? In the community, right? You can see that in fertility rates, employment rates. COVID, of course, sped up a lot of these changes, one of the biggest ones being technology. And for example, willingness to, use Zoom for classes or connect with people on, all through all sorts of social media. There is a robust Haredi internet culture, right? That tends to be more, I don't think that we're liberal, but more open, more conversational, less regulated. Websites like the Haredi or Kikar Sabbaths are places where there's a lot of discussion. There are still sort of mainstream media outlets, Yated Ne'eman, Hamodia, that are still controlled by rabbinical establishments and tend to be more conservative. And also, as I said, there's this new sort of Haredi middle class, and also what some people call modern Haredim, around 10% or so. And these are people who are very engaged in social media, are interested in being part of the Israeli world around them, are often sort of overrepresented for obvious reasons, right? Show up on TV a lot. There's a lot of them who actually, for Haredi women especially, there are a lot of them who have big Instagram followings, and there's interesting things happening there. And also just in terms of living and living patterns, it's important to know that the biggest settlements in Israel are Haredi. Beitar Illit is probably the most famous one, but as the Haredi community has grown, they've expanded where they live, and one of the places that they've gone is outside of, let's say, Bnei Brak in Jerusalem, but to parts of the West Bank, and also especially in the north and the south. And women are more educated than men, and often work more than men, and often they're more in touch with Israeli society around them. That's the point we'll go back to. a colleague of mine, Dr. Nuflumi Yafi, who was the first Haredi woman in Israel to get a PhD, she's a fascinating person herself, her research is also incredible. She actually says that these distinctions of Hasidish and Yeshivish are less important than they used to be. And the more important, or the better way to understand the community is how much they are connected to wider society. So for example, do you have a filter on your internet or not? Right? Do you use social media or not? Do you vacation abroad or not? She would argue is a better way to understand Israeli Haredi society than these, what rabbi do you associate with, etc. The last thing I want to mention before I talk about October 7th are the tensions with judicial reform, right? As a lot of you probably know, before the events of the past year, there were huge debates about judicial reform in Israel. The Haredi community was generally pro this judicial reform, limiting the power of the Supreme Court, which they saw as an anti-religious institution. Just one example, Moti Steinmetz, who is a very interesting singer, he was set to perform a city-sponsored gender-segregated concert in Afula. There was a case, should that be allowed or not? The Supreme Court actually said it shouldn't be allowed, but in classic, perhaps fashion, they gave that ruling during the concert. So it didn't stop the actual concert from happening. And this was seen for the Haredi community as like an attack on their way of life. So there's been this increasing rightward shift in the community. And among some pockets, it turned even to the more extreme right. People like Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, have a lot of support in a lot of pockets of the Haredi community. Okay, so I want to talk about just the day itself and sort of how the Haredi community experienced it. Relating to what I said about living patterns, the south of Israel is actually 1/3 Haredi. That's because of places like Netivot, Arad, you want to count Ashkelon, Ofakim. These places have seen huge increases in Haredi Jews, and especially Mizrahi Haredi Jews, right? So they were often very affected by what happened. At the same time, because they're not as well organized, let's say, as many of the kibbutzim, they're often not as educated, right? Maybe they don't speak English as well. They got a lot less press time, right? In both the Israeli press, but also in the international press. But they were very, very affected. I also want to mention when we think about Mizrahi Haredim that there are still significant issues of racism in the community. I'll drop a TV recommendation, The New Black, or Shababnikim, which is a very funny show about these yeshiva guys, actually takes this issue on head on. And in addition, this is a big theme in Israeli society, but being on the periphery, even these Haredi Jews on the periphery, they felt that their stories have often been ignored, right, in favor of, right, the more privileged kibbutz stories. Of course, it was very confusing for Haredi Jews who were keeping the Sabbath when they found out, when they didn't find out, a lot of disinformation. And of course, the role of Haredi Jews as first responders. This becomes really, really important. There's an organization called Zaka, which is tasked with being first responders. They are not only trained in first aid, they also want to make sure that bodies are given the appropriate respect that they are accrued in Jewish tradition, which means burial of the entire body, which, without getting into gruesome detail, was very complicated, right, in the aftermath of October 7th. They became very well known for what happened on that day. Some consider them national heroes. I also say there's been a lot of criticism of them. We can talk about it maybe more in the Q&A, but they became known as sort of playing this role, which they, again, have been doing for a long time, but on a bigger national stage. Now, if we think about sort of the short term of what things happen, not just on that day, but in the immediate aftermath, I would say one of the most important things is the spiritual, right? How did Haredi Jews understand this in a theological or moral sense? And yes, there is what I would, there is definitely, I would say, theodicy that blames, let's say, secular Jews for being at a party on Simchat Torah, on a Jewish holiday, right, instead of being in synagogue. There are those, but that's actually not, I would say, the mainstream. What it's important to understand is that this takes place, right, at the end of the fall holiday cycle, right? This is a time of intense religious devotion, and usually in the sort of the cycle of things, Simchat Torah at the end is a sort of catharsis, right? It's after Yom Kippur and celebratory, and this is a real gut punch, right, for a lot of people, especially in the Haredi community. I mean, it wasn't just the Haredi community that shared that, they feel it very, very strongly. And there's a real sense that this is maybe some sort of divine punishment, not because there were secular people, but because Israel was divided, right? There's a lot of sense of like, the Jews of Israel were too divided, and this is sort of some divine punishment for what happened. That relates to what happens also, which is civil society, right? The Haredi community responds in unprecedented ways with volunteering and civil society. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of initiatives. There is everything from bringing cholent to the soldiers, right? Literally, I was telling Jessica, you see these videos of maybe not the most like cleanly big pots of, which Sabbaths do, and bringing them to the front line. There are Hasidim visiting soldiers, right, and hospitals. And I will say also, this is a place where women are actually really, really involved. There's an organization that starts almost immediately called Iron Sisters. They have, my friend Naomi, who was involved with some of this, she says that within 36 hours, they have tens of thousands of people signing up. And while the Haredi community has been known for its extensive social support networks, some of you may know of things like the mosques, free loan societies that help the community out. This was the first time it had really gone outward, right, towards the non-Haredi community. I just want to mention one story. This is in an essay about Haredi women in the aftermath. And I think it really shares how things like working and being connected to the larger world affects a mindset. So I'm just going to read a paragraph from it. A friend shared that she encountered a colleague crying in the coffee room one day during Hanukkah. The colleague explained she was spending the holiday alone because her husband wasn't released from the army, and she had no family in the country, a lone soldier and a lone woman. This situation caused great embarrassment for me, my friend shared. Just moments before, I actively participated in the family group discussion planning our family Hanukkah party. No one in my family had been drafted, and the party was planned as usual. What a shameful disparity, right? So you could chalk this up as almost like contact theory, right? This woman is working, has some sort of, job where she is not only with other Haredim, and she is exposed, right, to what a lot of wider Israeli society is going through. And you can see with someone thinking like that, even if, we'll talk about this, should Haredim serve in the army, should they not, right? She can see the difference and she feels not nice about it, right? So I think some of that discomfort really comes out in this volunteering. I will also say that the Haredi community actually, like in Corona, goes back to school much quicker than the secular world, which again, some criticized, some supported. They really felt that this is what we had to do. Also, they could do it, right? They were not as affected by the mass call of soldiers. They had the manpower or the people power to sort of restart their lives. My talk is focused on Israel, but I just want to mention America briefly and the American Haredi community. You see tension of sort of, should there be public support of Israel, should there not, in the Haredi community as well. There was actually a split in the Agudas Yisrael, which is sort of a, I would say, very middle of the road American, it's an international organization, but American Haredi, in other places it acts as a political party, here we'll say it's an organization. there's a debate about whether they should go to the big November rally that happened for American Jews to show their support in Israel. I would say that this is often a debate between rabbinic leadership and the mainstream. The mainstream Haredi community is often much more openly supportive of Israel, or much more likely to be politically right-wing, as we know. And we see that tension play out. There was one of the Satmar rabbis, because there are two, sort of the most strident anti-Zionist organizations, had to actually say, remember, we are anti-Zionist. Like, it's one thing to care for your fellow Jews, but we don't support the state of Israel. So if the Satmar Rebbe has to say it, or one of them, it's a sense that maybe they're worried about losing the plot. And of course, with all this going into civil society, you see backlash, right? In the Haredi world, you see rabbis who are saying, this is all a distraction. Your job, when something bad happens, and this is of course directed at the men, sit and learn Torah. That's what we do, right? And this divide of who sort of approves and who doesn't often falls on ethnic lines. The Ashkenazi rabbinic establishment is much more conservative. They're the ones generally telling their community not to do these things. Whether or not they listen is a different story. The Mizrahi community, the Mizrahi rabbis are supporting these efforts. You'll see videos of, again, rabbis going out into the field, offering blessings, right, all sorts of things. The Mizrahi Haredi community often come from families where observance levels are mixed. So there might be one Haredi brother, but there's a secular sister, there's a more traditional brother-in-law, right? And they often tend to be somewhat more moderate in how they think about their approach to the state. And you see that here. And that is also similar to what happened during Corona as well. The last thing I want to talk about is a sort of big thing that I think everyone is thinking about, and that's the draft, right? What is going on with the draft? How can we think about this? Just to give some back story, the original deal, right, made by David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, is that he would exempt ultra-Orthodox men from service. The men, and the phrase is Torah to umunah, which I would translate as the Torah is their profession. They are full-time learners. It's only a couple hundred people. That's where people usually would talk about. What they often forget is that those provisions were greatly expanded by Menachem Begin in the late 70s, by Israel's first right-wing prime minister, and is a large part of how sort of the ultra-Orthodox community became affiliated with the right wing. There's a long, long story of exemptions, where the exemptions stand, what the rule is, you know, do they have to follow the rule being, I'm not going to go into like every Supreme Court thing. There is currently a fight about daycare subsidies. If someone, you know, there's free daycare, I should say, from age 3 and above in Israel, but there are, you know, there's sort of young daycare for younger kids before. There's currently a big debate, if someone does not go to the army, should they be eligible for daycare subsidies, right? Even if they, which is one of the big questions. This fight about whether ultra-Orthodox men should serve in the army, as I said, is not new, but obviously a lot has changed since. One, of course, is just the nature of the military and of warfare, right? Again, before October 7th, there was a lot of discussion in the Israeli military about how armies have gotten smaller. Warfare was not infantry or ground forces, but it's drones, it's computers, right? That, of course, has shifted, right, in light of what's been happening. There was a real sense that cyber would save Israel, right? That a small, super smart army would do the job. That is no longer the current contemporary wisdom. Another thing is that while there have been small attempts at combat units or units for ultra-Orthodox Jews, Nafal Haredi is probably the most famous one, or Netzach Yehuda. These were actually usually seen as places for total dropouts from the Haredi community. People really living on the margins, people with criminal records, people who came from broken homes. And it becomes like a self-reinforcing thing, right? If the only people who go there are the dropouts, the marginal, the youth at risk, right? Even if you're a sort of quote unquote, you're interested in the army, but you're a good kid, right? You're not going to necessarily want to go there. So that becomes a cycle. There are huge amounts of human rights abuses in this unit. And here I'm talking before October 7th. There are so many that the army actually moves them. The army moves them from the West Bank to what at that point was a relatively quiet border, to the northern border with Lebanon. And this was also in the news recently when the United States was dropped hints, right, that it was thinking about sanctioning parts of the the Israeli military for human rights abuses. Its big example was actually Netzach Yehuda, was this. And it was not based on things that had happened after October 7th, it was based on things that came before. We have also seen what's called Shlav Bet, or Plan B, which is when older men, usually married, do some sort of basically desk service, often in technology, where they are in a fully Haredi environment. They are able to learn part of the day, study part of the day. They often get some sort of job training, let's say some sort of coding certificate or that sort of thing. It's a shortened service. There's no real basic training. And that has had some successes, right? And generally speaking, the rabbinic establishment has been more willing to do so because it's post-marriage, right? You don't mix with the rest of the general army. It's important to realize that for those who serve, which is obviously not everyone in Israel, the army is one of the first times that Jewish Israelis meet people who are not like them. It's one of the reasons why for religious Zionists, the huge dropout rates, which are somewhere around 20–25%, it happens in the army. That's the first place that they are outside of these frameworks. And the Haredi community knows this, and that is not what they want for their own community. I will also say that this is a two-way street, that the IDF has not always been convinced that the Haredi community will make good soldiers. They are not trained, not necessarily, and here we're speaking in very broad stereotypes, of course, not necessarily interested in physical health and being part of a unit and working out, right? There's a sense of lead sedentary lifestyle, that the amount of human resources meant to bring them up to speed is not necessarily worth the army's time, right? From a strictly, again, almost like HR operations point of view. There's also not the frameworks for the ultra-Orthodox community like there is for the religious Zionist community. The religious Zionist community has what's called Hesder programs, year programs, all these sort of separate arrangements, which come with their own controversy, that allow religious Zionist men to serve in a way that enables them to keep certain commandments, pray, have special kosher food, etc. That does not exist for the Haredi world, outside of these very specific circumstances. And one of the controversial things about the demands of the Haredi who do serve is that they do not want to be anywhere with women. They often demand that there are no women on their bases. They often say that, so for example, women are sometimes like shooting instructors or tank instructors. They do not want any women to serve in those roles. They sometimes will say they don't want any women to be secretaries. And just to give one example, when the IDF moved Netzach Yehuda from the West Bank to the northern border, they actually had to relocate several women from that base. So it really becomes a very quick clash of values, right? What do you do? Where are their priorities? And there's a lot of discussion about this. I will say there are also religious Jewish women who serve, another discussion, but it becomes very much part of this. So at the same time, there has been significant, I would say, a huge growth in support for some sort of limited service for the Haredi community from before the war. You know, different surveys say now it's somewhere, some say 35%, some say 60%. Again, debate which polls you like, but all talk about a significant increase and a significant jump. The Haredi community also knows that this ideal of all the men studying isn't happening in reality, right? That there are plenty of people who are not really studying, who are, as I say, if you spent time in some of the fancier parts of West Jerusalem, you may have seen it yourself, right? A lot of ultra-Orthodox men, especially hanging out, especially in Mamilla, some other places when they sort of should be theoretically studying. And there's a real sense that maybe not everyone should be enlisted, but the people who are, let's say, hanging out in Mamilla and drinking coffee, maybe they could be doing something. And you're starting to hear those voices from some parts of the Haredi community. Another thing that is new here, and this is really interesting, is that the religious Zionist community is one of the leading voices of critique of the Haredi community. Usually the debate about who should enlist is portrayed as this religious secular thing, with critique coming from secular Israeli Jews. Here, or what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, is that the religious Zionist world has almost as much, if not more, incredibly strong critiques of the Haredi community. And that's for an obvious reason, which is that this community has been hit very, very hard by losses. In terms of military losses. There are huge percentages from this community of people that have been lost, men that have been killed, also men that have been called up. They are overrepresented, which also has to do with changes in Israeli society. And there's a real sense of, if we, now here I'll use their voice, that sort of, if we conserve and keep our religious identity and study Jewish texts, why can't you? Right? There was a video that went viral, and an American rabbi translated it, Rabbi Granot, whose son was killed, where he says, basically, like, don't you hear the blood of your brother crying out from the ground, right? Using these like really core biblical images to think about it. But there do seems to be these shifts. Perhaps one of the best indication for this is, I mentioned again, my colleague Nahami, she does these weekly surveys of the Haredi community, or through one of the big websites. And one of the best ways to measure societal norms is to ask about, would this hurt your marriage prospects, right? So would you go out with a guy you serve, right? Again, thinking of semi-arranged marriages, right, in the Haredi world, sometimes it's a formal matchmaker, sometimes it might be an aunt or a cousin, comes to a young woman and says, I have a great guy for you, he's served, or he's gonna serve. Would this hurt his chances or not? And it seems to be that the idea that it would hurt his chances, and the idea that's more socially acceptable, are going down. And in the more modern Haredi community, serving among the men is becoming somewhat more popular. Again, are those changes last? Are those, I could argue these people are overrepresented because of the people we see on Instagram, right, posting themselves in uniform and things like that, but there is something. I would say the biggest indication that there is a change is there actually have been protests against some of the rabbis who are pushing for that. And as I tell my students, you think about, sometimes you look at Haredi communities and you'll see, the classic, you'll see like the wall posters, right? No iPhones aren't allowed. Well, that's because people have iPhones, right? You only fight against something that's happening. So the fact that more conservative elements protested some of this, I would say is an indication that something is happening. So to sum up and then take questions and we'll think, is that there are these trends of nationalism and citizenship that go together with this turn towards the right, a sense of wanting to contribute to the war effort, whether through military service or volunteering, and a sense of communal mourning where they feel connected with Israeli society. And now I want to come back to the point that I made earlier, which are these things really new? I would argue not necessarily. I've been thinking a lot about Hillel Cohen's book, 1929, Year Zero of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which is a phenomenal book. And one of the things he talks about a lot is how violence, in this case, violence against Haredi Jews, especially in Hebron and also Tiberias, caused the Haredi Jews to sort of identify with the Zionist project after the fact. Right? Yes, there are ideological differences, but we were attacked just as they were, sort of to think about that. And I think in a lot of ways, even though obviously this was hugely traumatic and important, and we're still, it'll take us decades to figure out, that it's actually just the acceleration of a lot of changes. But I also want to argue that the sort of public conversation, which is about the draft, is important, but it's not the only thing. And if we're thinking in terms of policy and sort of larger social issues, enlistment will not necessarily solve the gap between rich and poor, right? The issue of the role of women, which is changing rapidly, right? It's actually another callback to sort of earlier Jewish history where the women are significantly more educated than the men, and the tension that rises. And also the increasing sort of nationalism, or especially ultra-nationalism, in certain parts of the Haredi community. So for example, you may have heard of incidents of violence in the Old City against Christian clergy, right? Some of that is a manifestation. So, so I'll end there. I thank you all so much for coming. I am excited to hear your questions, your comments, and yeah, thanks so much.
So Mike, the folks on the Zoom know that we're.
Yep, I let them know.
Questions. And while we're waiting for the digital masses to join us, questions here?
Yeah, go for it. And can you just say your name?
I'm Jordan.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about maybe more of the dissenting Haredi voices about serving, maybe more of the non and anti-Zionist sects of that. I'm a little interested to hear.
You mean the people who, so let me just say, so sort of the people who are still saying we shouldn't serve.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, there's always been a small but very strong anti-Zionist sort of faction within the Haredi world. And although they are definitely not the majority, they are often very, very loud, and they often know how to get a lot of attention. Protest, lighting tires on fire. Again, it's a lot of men in their 20s who don't necessarily have other things to do. Again, if you study social movements, this is like classic. And you see, and you see them saying, no, nothing's changed. Why do you think anything has changed, right? You'll still see some people who are more moderate who will say, no, we shouldn't serve, our job is Torah. Maybe some people can serve, as I mentioned before. And then this is small, but you do see it, is a growing, and again, we're not talking here about tons of people, but you will see it, of people in the Haredi community who have connected with the Israeli left, whether it's the anti-Zionist left or just the sort of more standard left, and see their service, their refusal, as part of a sort of protest against occupation, against Israel, etc. I'm not saying this is the majority opinion by any stretch of the imagination. It is not, but you do see it. One of the things that's interesting is that the resurgence of what's called Smol Emuni, the faithful left. I'm friendly with some of the organizers. He told me, one of them told me that they were originally going to call it the Dati left, but there were so many ultra-Orthodox Jews involved, and they were like, we're not Dati, we're Haredis, we have to change the name. And he actually was shocked at how many came from the Haredi world. So you do, and it's interesting, right? Because even among like scholars, right, you'll see like, I'll say this is something I'll complain about, is like you'll read an article about like conscientious objectors, and there'll be a footnote being like, well, obviously Haredi men and women don't serve. And I'm like, well, is that really obvious? And maybe we should consider them under the same framework. But I think there's a lot more to be done about thinking about these groups as maybe the most successful resistors, so to speak, of Zionism and the regime, but they're a pretty small minority. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to, in some sense, ask about the other sort of side, of maybe, that kind of process of ideological change. And you made reference to, Haredi ultranationalism. And I mean, and you did so, I think maybe this was an accident, it's proper structure, but I think it's also provocative and useful. You did so as you were thinking of things that maybe are all not all that new, right? And I recall some of the statistics on flat out, straightforward, anti-Arab racism. When you looked at the stats, the kind of stuff that you can think about from an American context, wouldn't want to live next door to sort of stuff. The Haredi racism was off the charts in Israel. It was indeed shockingly higher than the subset of Dati, which I mean, there's things that are hidden by that, obviously. And my guess is that's only gotten worse since I think the Pew research of the 2013. I mean, unless it hasn't, but and I've also talked to folks. I remember talking to Josh Shayna a little bit about some of his observations. It wasn't doing ethnography, but some of his observations about what he was finding when he spent a little time at some of the Haredi type settings, where as far as I can tell, the kind of intense anti-Palestinian activism and readiness for a kind of pogrom-style violence on the edges of those settlements is just as robust as it might be anywhere else. So, I mean, and my guess is that the seventh only intensifies that. So maybe thinking also in relation to your answer to the last question. I mean, can you start to, what are the sources and what are the kind of indications that you can put your finger on that would help us think about the ways in which the seventh, the experience of the seventh, perception of that experience, the experience and perception of the war since then, or Gaza, right? How have these things actually resonated with ideological trends vis-a-vis Jewish-Palestinian relations in the Haredi community?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that the decline of Haredi political parties, right? These political parties are not nearly as powerful as they once were. They are hopelessly out of touch, right? With Haredi mainstream society. There was I think it was when Steinman died, right? Or Steinman, and he was 99, and they passed it on to Gershon Edelstein, who's 96. And again, maybe all these people live and be well, but there was a lot of jokes about it, right? And a lot of discussion. In the institutions that are still controlled by the newspapers and things like that, they're still heavily censored, right? That conversation, I say, where a lot of people have moved to the internet. So first, there's a real sense of out of touch, and the significant portion of Mizrahi Haredim who are already feeling that they are discriminated against, and are interested in populism. Ben Gvir is really appealing to them. He sits with them, he hangs out with them, he talks to them, and I don't think that can be underestimated, right? For that just emotional, like, we are being taken care of, someone finally cares about us. One of the things also is that I don't like using the terms like more Israelified, because I think that's too simple, but as Haredi Jews feel that they are more and more part of Israeli wider society, they take on those aspects, right? And Israeli society is increasingly right-wing, and there's a lot to talk about with incidents of racism within Israel, right, against Israeli Palestinians and all that sort of thing. So in that sense, they are, I don't want to say mimicking, that's not the right word, but following those trends. There was a profile a couple of months ago of Yitzhak Goldknopf, who I think is the housing minister. He talks about how October 7th changed him. And he says, so that's the first time in his life he quote broke Shabbat. Someone actually had to come and get him from synagogue. And he says that it has made him feel more connected to Jewish Israelis and hardened how he felt against Palestinians. It's sort of hard for us, I think, to think about it because the reality now is so different. But in the days leading up to Oslo, the Haredi community was, I wouldn't call it quite dovish, but I would say was willing to support Oslo in the peace process as long as it got what it wanted from the government, which was support for its own social programming. Which coming from a sort of more socialist government, there was already sort of more idea of support for, schools, social welfare, etc. I would also argue is that in this society, this is a quote unquote porous society. There's not discussions of civics, right? There's not discussions of democratic or liberal values. Not to say that it's amazingly done in mainstream Israeli society, I would argue that it's not, but it's not there at all, right? And with all of these things, it leads to a power vacuum, and that's a perfect place, right, for more extreme voices to come in.
We have a question now from one of our digital participants, Elliot asks, I'm interested in hearing whether our talk of West Bank annexation affects Haredi conversation on survey. Does the possibility of better access to controlled holy sites in West Bank change the calculus at all?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of appeal to the holy sites. I would say there's already access to quite a lot of them. If you saw what happened this week with, for example, Rachel's yard site, right, the biblical Rachel's yard site. The one place where there are still clashes, I mean, obviously Hebron to some extent, and Joseph's tomb, which is near Shechem, Nablus. I don't think it's about religious sites so much. I think that's a bonus, it's a plus. I think it's about housing. I think it's about really practical things for a lot of people, and again, up against a lot of these ideas that we talked about before. Yeah. That's a good question, though. I have to think more about it.
Well, I mean,
Was that Sheila's question?
Sorry, oh, good, okay. So Sheila Dillon asks, can you say more about the religious women who serve in the army? You don't mean Haredi women do. What role does Shayna Weiss play in the country these days?
Right, so this is not talking about the Haredi community at all, but I'll talk about the question. So in the religious Zionist community, the official sort of line is that religious women, or that the women shouldn't serve in the army, they should do something called Shir Leumi, which is a sort of national service. There has been an increasing trend in religious Zionist women to serve. Somewhere around 40% of those who graduate from religious Zionist circles do serve. There are programs for religious Zionists to serve, religious Zionist women, like similar to Hesder programs. One program is called Hadass, right, for the fun play on words. Is that a feminist thing? Is that an integration into Israeli society thing? Probably a bit of both. Especially if a woman has certain skills, let's say she speaks Arabic well or Persian well, there's a sense that she's sort of quote unquote wasted if she goes to national service versus the army. And I would say most of them don't necessarily serve in combat. The vast majority of them don't, but there are some who do. What's I think also important when we discuss about Haredi, I will say as well, some of the most intense opposition to women's, women being able to serve in tanks and things like that, comes from right-wing factors in sections in the religious Zionist world. Eli Sedan, Yigal Lowenstein, these are names that some of you might recognize. They often speak very, very strongly against these women who they feel like are going against their religious values. It's a really interesting trend. And it's really interesting to think about, sort of how it will play out, but it's a different population. You will very occasionally hear individual stories of like, I don't know, I read one newspaper article about a Haredi mother of 7 who volunteered for the police guard. Sure, I mean, great, but that's not an indication of any larger trend, which is why I think it's important to realize that while the conversation about the draft is important, it can't be the only part of how we think about this.
I'd like to come back around. You made reference to, broadly speaking, folks whose Haredi kind of intersect with their Mizrahi background and identity. But let's also look at other parts of that community. And I wonder to what degree, this also circles back around the question about the intellectual grounds of Haredi anti-Zionism or opposition to service. Can you drill down a little more deeply into sort of theological dimensions of what's going on in this community, or maybe you think that's not necessarily all that useful for us to speak about? And I'm thinking about to what degree are there new, let's call them theologizations of the kind of rightist sentiments that we hear. You talked about the sort of turn to Ben Gvir, sort of terms of social contagion, imitation, young men are looking for something. I'm sure that's all true, but I also think about someone like Yitzhak Ginsburg. I think
Right.
about figures that are at least linked to the margins, maybe not the margins of Chabad. So I'm just, where are there forms of, and for Ginsburg, the racism is theological all the way down, right? So I've heard said that he's quite an exceptional figure, maybe, but I'm kind of curious about where you see those kinds of voices. Do you see those kind of voices? Do you see them amongst sort of these Mashiachim, these figures who are super online and have their own followers, and they're I was thinking that Benny Brown was writing about them, and they're not in this particular context, but in the sense that there are new kinds of voices of influence and intellectual power, as it were, in the Haredi community, especially that part that's online. Are you seeing new kinds of things in the realm of intellectual life and theological tendencies since the 70s?
Yes, definitely. I would say also, when a lot of these rabbis speak, they speak in theological terms, right? So that's often, first of all, just the primary language they go to, because that's the world they live in. I would say, and Ginsburg is definitely part of this, but is the huge popularity, usage, whatever, of Jewish mystical discourse. Part of this is not just because people like Ginsburg are very, very interested in it. Part of it is because Israeli Jews on the whole are really interested in mysticism. Rabbi Nachman, all sorts of things. There's a huge interest in Kabbalah, and Hasidut, etc. You see Israeli celebrities, even if they don't describe themselves as sort of dati or Orthodox with capital letters, will go to Uman, will quote Rabbi Nachman in their Instagram posts. There's actually a Haaretz profile about this a month or so ago. And yes, the online stuff is huge. There's a lot of short sound bites, and of course, in times of crisis, messianic ideals are always there and always become more popular. And I have seen that spread really, I would say, way more through the community. And I think all those things converge in talking about this. I would say one of the big things is, of course, the standard, or is it standard, maybe classic idea of the Nitzitzot, right? There is this secular sort of framing, but that's just a framing. It's not inside. Every Jew has, a holy spark that they're trying to get out, right? And in some ways, it's maybe the classic Rav Kook justification of Zionism. That, if we think about Gaza, we see this, right? It's not just, oh, we're fighting to save Jew, again, if you're accepting the secular language of the war, like, it's not just the idea of fighting to protect its citizens, it's the idea of redeeming what happened in Gaza 20 years ago with the disengagement, raising the sparks, that it's implanting holiness, right? All the stuff about religious, the first menorah, that's been lit in 20 years, the Chabad house, the rituals, that sort of thing. It's all relying very heavily on those images, and yeah, there's a lot of wild stuff online, and a lot of sort of populist rabbis who are doing this, and of course, providing inspiration for the community. And the last thing I'll say is that in a time where I'd say maybe political leadership seems to be lacking in Israel, even among people who support the war, here's a really compelling framework to convince you to continue what you're doing.